The city breathes in smoke and liquor, humming with the rhythm of jazz and the echo of distant gunfire. Cars glide through rain-soaked streets, their headlights carving through fog like knives. Behind those lights, beyond the laughter spilling from speakeasies, a quiet revolution is unfolding, one that will forever change the criminal underworld of America. They call him Lucky. Not because he was born fortunate, but because he survived when others didn't. Stabbed, shot, betrayed, Charles Lucky Luciano lived through every ambush the streets threw at him. Yet luck was only part of the story. His true gift was vision, the ability to see order where others saw chaos, to turn bloodshed into business and crime into empire. In the shadow of the Great Depression, America was fractured. The poor fought for scraps, and the law looked the other way as money moved through alleys, wharfs, and backroom bars. It was a time when morality was negotiable, and power was for sale to the highest bidder. For Luciano, this chaos wasn't a curse, it was opportunity. He watched the old Sicilian bosses cling to outdated codes of loyalty and revenge, and he knew their days were numbered. America was changing, and the Mafia would have to change with it. This is the world we enter, where immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe carved out their own justice with blades and bullets. New York's Five Points district had become a crucible of ambition and violence, a place where every boy learned early that survival depended on alliances. Luciano rose from these streets not as a brute, but as a strategist. While others fought for blocks, he dreamed of cities. Picture it, a smoky backroom in Manhattan. Men with scarred faces and heavy accents argue in Sicilian and English, each claiming to be the rightful heir to the underworld. Luciano sits quietly at the edge of the table, cigarette between his fingers, eyes calculating. He's listening, learning. Every word, every grudge, every weakness becomes part of a grander equation. He doesn't need to shout to be heard. His silence speaks louder than their fury. Outside, prohibition has turned the nation into a gold rush for the corrupt. Bootleg liquor flows like a river through the veins of the city, greasing palms from bartenders to politicians. And in this current, Luciano swims effortlessly. To him, the law isn't an obstacle, it's just another business expense. But beneath the glamour lies something darker, the psychology of control. Luciano understands fear. He knows it can destroy men, but also bind them. He uses it carefully, mixing charm with threat, loyalty with manipulation. To his associates, he's both a brother and a godfather, a man who rewards generously but punishes absolutely. As the narrator's voice moves through the scene, the tone sharpens. The story is not merely about crime, it's about transformation. Luciano isn't content to be a gangster, he wants to be an architect. He sees the Mafia not as a collection of street thugs, but as a corporation, a machine powered by greed, loyalty, and precision. In his mind, there's no difference between a Wall Street tycoon and a mob boss, except that one wears a suit bought legally. By the time the sun rises over the East River, the camera pans over the city skyline. The voiceover lowers to a whisper. Before him there was chaos. After him there would be order. But order built on fear has its own price. The music swells, blending brass and menace. Faces flash across the screen, men who will soon live and die under Luciano's reign. Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, Vito Genovese. Their names, like his, will become legend. This is not just the story of a man, it's the story of an empire born from the streets. A tale of vision, betrayal, and ambition that redefined the very meaning of organized crime. From the smoke of prohibition to the gilded rooms of power, Lucky Luciano will rise to become both kingmaker and condemned man. And as the rain falls again on Mulberry Street, we realize the irony at the heart of his legend, that the man who sought to control chaos would ultimately be consumed by it. The city breathes in smoke and liquor, humming with the rhythm of jazz and the echo of distant gunfire. Cars glide through rain-soaked streets, their headlights carving through fog like knives. Behind those lights, beyond the laughter spilling from speakeasies, a quiet revolution is unfolding, one that will forever change the criminal underworld of America. They call him Lucky. Not because he was born fortunate, but because he survived when others didn't. Stabbed, shot, betrayed, Charles Lucky Luciano lived through every ambush the streets threw at him. Yet luck was only part of the story. His true gift was vision, the ability to see order where others saw chaos, to turn bloodshed into business and crime into empire. In the shadow of the Great Depression, America was fractured. The poor fought for scraps, and the law looked the other way as money moved through alleys, wharfs, and backroom bars. It was a time when morality was negotiable, and power was for sale to the highest bidder. For Luciano, this chaos wasn't a curse, it was opportunity. He watched the old Sicilian bosses cling to outdated codes of loyalty and revenge, and he knew their days were numbered. America was changing and the Mafia would have to change with it. This is the world we enter, where immigrants from Italy, Ireland and Eastern Europe carved out their own justice with blades and bullets. New York's Five Points district had become a crucible of ambition and violence, a place where every boy learned early that survival depended on alliances. Luciano rose from these streets not as a brute, but as a strategist. While others fought for blocks, he dreamed of cities. Picture it, a smoky backroom in Manhattan. Men with scarred faces and heavy accents argue in Sicilian and English, each claiming to be the rightful heir to the underworld. Luciano sits quietly at the edge of the table, cigarette between his fingers, eyes calculating. He's listening, learning. Every word, every grudge, every weakness becomes part of a grander equation. He doesn't need to shout to be heard. His silence speaks louder than their fury. Outside, prohibition has turned the nation into a gold rush for the corrupt. Bootleg liquor flows like a river through the veins of the city, greasing palms from bartenders to politicians. And in this current, Luciano swims effortlessly. To him, the law isn't an obstacle, it's just another business expense. But beneath the glamour lies something darker, the psychology of control. Luciano understands fear. He knows it can destroy men, but also bind them. He uses it carefully, mixing charm with threat, loyalty with manipulation. To his associates, he's both a brother and a godfather, a man who rewards generously but punishes absolutely. As the narrator's voice moves through the scene, the tone sharpens. The story is not merely about crime, it's about transformation. Luciano isn't content to be a gangster, he wants to be an architect. He sees the Mafia not as a collection of street thugs, but as a corporation, a machine powered by greed, loyalty, and precision. In his mind, there's no difference between a Wall Street tycoon and a mob boss, except that one wears a suit bought legally. By the time the sun rises over the East River, the camera pans over the city skyline. The voiceover lowers to a whisper. Before him there was chaos. After him there would be order. But order built on fear has its own price. The music swells, blending brass and menace. Faces flash across the screen, men who will soon live and die under Luciano's reign. Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, Vito Genovese. Their names, like his, will become legend. This is not just the story of a man, it's the story of an empire born from the streets. A tale of vision, betrayal, and ambition that redefined the very meaning of organized crime. From the smoke of prohibition to the gilded rooms of power, Lucky Luciano will rise to become both kingmaker and condemned man. And as the rain falls again on Mulberry Street, we realize the irony at the heart of his legend, that the man who sought to control chaos would ultimately be consumed by it. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in the small Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti, a place of sun-baked poverty and ancient codes. His father was a sulfur miner, his mother a stern woman who believed that faith and fear were the same thing. The Lucania family dreamed of America, the mythical land of opportunity where a man could become anything he wanted. When Salvatore was 9 years old, they boarded a ship and crossed the Atlantic, leaving behind the old world for the raw chaos of the new. The Lower East Side of Manhattan was a different kind of battlefield. Immigrants from every nation crowded into crumbling tenements. The streets smelled of sweat, bread, and desperation. Kids fought for territory with sticks and stones, speaking a half-dozen languages but understanding only one law: survival. Little Salvatore quickly learned that America was not the promised land. It was a place where you either hustled or you starved. At school he was teased for his accent. He dropped out before he was 14, preferring the freedom of the streets to the boredom of classrooms. On Mulberry Street he met other boys like him, Jewish, Irish, and Italian kids, all fighting to escape poverty. Among them was a quiet, sharp-minded boy named Meyer Lansky. That friendship would become one of the most unlikely and enduring alliances in the history of organized crime. Luciano and Lansky shared the same gift, a mind built for calculation. Where others saw danger, they saw opportunity. The pair began running small hustles, dice games, protection rackets, stolen goods. Luciano had charm. He could talk his way into or out of anything. Lansky had precision. He remembered every number, every face, every debt. Together they became street entrepreneurs. By 16, Luciano was working for local gangsters, delivering drugs and liquor, collecting debts, and learning how power moved. He admired the older Italian bosses who commanded respect without lifting a finger. But he also saw their weakness, their refusal to adapt, their obsession with Sicilian purity. Luciano didn't care where a man came from. He cared only about whether he could make money. That philosophy would one day redefine the Mafia. In the 1910s, the Lower East Side was boiling with opportunity for those willing to risk it. The city was a living organism and crime was its bloodstream. Luciano began making connections with Jewish gangs, Irish union fixers, and corrupt police officers. He learned early that the line between criminal and businessman was paper-thin. Both needed influence and both relied on loyalty. But his ascent wasn't without scars. In 1929, Luciano's life nearly ended on a cold April night. He was abducted by unknown men, possibly rivals, possibly cops, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. Somehow he survived. When police found him, his face was unrecognizable. The newspapers called him Lucky, the nickname that would follow him forever. Luciano never revealed who ordered the attack. He simply healed, hardened, and moved on. Survival had taught him the most valuable lesson of all. Never let emotion cloud business. By the early 1920s, Prohibition had transformed New York into a kingdom of illicit wealth. Speakeasies glowed like embers in the night, and bootleg liquor became the city's lifeblood. Luciano entered this world not as a soldier but as a broker. He knew everyone: Italians, Jews, Irishmen, corrupt politicians. He had a rare gift for diplomacy in a world built on violence. He could share whiskey with Irish gang leaders one night and dine with Sicilian dons the next. He began working under Joe Masuria, one of the city's most powerful bosses. Masuria, known as Joe the Boss, was a crude, old-fashioned leader, superstitious, suspicious, and stuck in the old ways. Luciano played the loyal lieutenant but quietly built his own network beneath the surface. He saw that Masuria's rule was unsustainable. The streets were changing. The next generation of gangsters, American-born, bilingual, and pragmatic, were ready to seize control from the old-world traditionalists. Outside the Mafia, Luciano cultivated relationships that would shape his empire. He and Meyer Lansky deepened their partnership, bringing in Lansky's volatile friend Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a man as charismatic as he was deadly. Together, the trio began to form the blueprint of organized crime's future, a multi-ethnic syndicate built not on bloodlines but on profit. Luciano's charm became his greatest weapon. He dressed like a banker, spoke like a gentleman, and moved through New York's elite circles as if he belonged there. Unlike the brutish gangsters of his time, he didn't crave attention. He craved control. His ambition was quiet, strategic, patient. Behind every handshake there was a calculation. Behind every smile, a potential advantage. By his mid-20s, he was already one of the city's most connected figures. The police knew his name but they couldn't touch him. He paid the right people, kept his hands clean, and let others do the dirty work. His reputation grew, not just as a survivor but as a man who could make things run smoothly. And yet, beneath his calm exterior, Luciano was haunted by a truth he couldn't escape. The world he wanted to build could not exist under the old rules. The Mafia's obsession with Sicilian tradition was a chain, not a shield. The future would belong to those who could think like Americans, fast, ruthless, and opportunistic. Each night, as he walked through the neon-lit streets of Manhattan, Luciano saw something few others could: the blueprint of a new order. The city wasn't just a collection of gangs, it was a system waiting to be organized, a fortune waiting to be controlled. All it needed was someone bold enough to impose order. That boy from Sicily, once mocked for his accent and beaten in alleys, had transformed into something far more dangerous: a visionary in a criminal world that had never known vision. Soon the name Lucky Luciano would no longer belong to a survivor, it would belong to a king. But kings aren't born. They're built, one hustle, one scar, and one betrayal at a time. The 1920s were a gold rush for criminals. Prohibition had turned ordinary liquor into liquid gold, and the underworld into a shadow empire. It was in this fertile ground that Charles Lucky Luciano began to rise, not just as a gangster but as a strategist. He had spent years watching others claw at scraps. Now he would build something bigger. Something that would make the old world irrelevant. The speakeasies of New York hummed with a dangerous glamour. Behind velvet curtains and whispered passwords, the city's thirst for forbidden drink fueled a black market worth hundreds of millions. Men who once hustled nickels on street corners were suddenly dealing in fortunes. Luciano was among them, but unlike most, he didn't see prohibition as a temporary hustle. He saw it as infrastructure, a system waiting to be organized. Luciano became the crucial link between bootleggers, corrupt officials, and distributors. He forged alliances not based on ethnicity or tradition but on profit. He worked with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Irish mobsters who controlled the docks, and even with certain politicians who understood that crime, when well managed, could be far more profitable than law. Where Joe Masuria ruled through brute force, Luciano ruled through strategy. He understood logistics. He mapped the routes through which illegal liquor moved from Canada and the Caribbean into New York. He knew which police precincts could be bought and which needed to be avoided. He turned what had been a messy, violent bootlegging war into an efficient operation. To his partners, he wasn't just another gangster, he was a businessman. This modern thinking put him at odds with the Mustache Petes, the old Sicilian bosses who still ran their operations like feudal lords. Joe Masuria, the man Luciano nominally served, embodied that old guard. Masuria demanded blind loyalty, believed only in Sicilian blood, and dismissed non-Italians as tools to be used and discarded. Luciano played the part of loyal lieutenant, nodding when Masuria spoke, collecting envelopes and smiling when required. But beneath the surface he was building his own empire, one handshake at a time. His relationship with Meyer Lansky deepened during these years. Lansky was cold and calculating, a numbers man. Together they began to sketch a structure that no one else in the underworld had dared imagine. A national criminal network, a syndicate that would run like a corporation. Their shared vision wasn't about ruling neighborhoods. It was about ruling industries. And Prohibition gave them the perfect testing ground. They refined the distribution system, increased efficiency, and eliminated unnecessary violence. Luciano understood something the old bosses didn't. Excessive bloodshed was bad for business. Bodies attracted cops. Cops meant raids. Raids meant lost money. His version of the Mafia would be cleaner, not morally but operationally. Yet power, even when carefully built, invites danger. Rivalry simmered just beneath the surface. Dutch Schultz, an unpredictable and ruthless bootlegger, clashed with Luciano's network. Schultz's volatility was a reminder of what the underworld truly was, a delicate balance between profit and violence. Luciano handled these tensions not with bullets but with negotiations. He was pragmatic. If someone could be useful, he made a deal. If not, he waited until the time was right to remove them. While others focused on liquor, Luciano expanded his reach. He moved into gambling, drugs, and prostitution, diversifying his revenue streams like a savvy CEO. His men didn't just smuggle. They managed logistics, bribed officials, and coordinated with other gangs across state lines. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the criminal landscape began to shift around him. His public persona was just as calculated. Luciano dressed impeccably, favoring tailored suits over street clothes. He dined in high-end restaurants, attended horse races, and made friends with powerful men in politics and business. To the outside world, he appeared less like a thug and more like a gentleman of influence. He understood something most gangsters never learned. Perception was power. But Luciano's true genius lay in how he dealt with internal enemies. Joe Masuria, the boss who had once been his patron, had become an obstacle. Masuria was old-fashioned, greedy, and dangerously paranoid. He saw Luciano's friendship with non-Italians as betrayal. He didn't understand that Luciano was playing a game bigger than turf wars. Behind closed doors, Luciano began quietly aligning himself with Masuria's enemies, including Salvatore Maranzano, a rival boss who shared his disdain for Masuria's outdated methods. Luciano understood that if he wanted to build a new order, the old king had to fall. But this wouldn't be a reckless coup. It would be precise, surgical, inevitable. Luciano also had something the old bosses lacked: loyalty built on opportunity, not fear. His men didn't follow him just because they were ordered to. They followed him because working for Luciano meant making money, moving up, and surviving. In a world where betrayal was as common as breathing, that kind of loyalty was revolutionary. By the late 1920s, Luciano had transformed from a street hustler into a power broker. He wasn't the most feared man in New York, not yet, but he was the most respected. He had money flowing from multiple enterprises, influence spreading through different communities, and allies on both sides of the law. In smoky backrooms across Manhattan, whispers began to circulate. Joe the boss was losing his grip. The old Sicilian ways were fading. And somewhere in the shadows, Lucky Luciano was quietly positioning himself as the future. He walked a dangerous tightrope, serving Masuria on the surface while undermining him in secret. One wrong step could mean a bullet in the back of his head. But Luciano thrived in that tension. He didn't fear it, he mastered it. The world of organized crime was a storm, and most men were simply trying to stay afloat. Luciano, on the other hand, was learning how to control the wind. And soon the wind would turn in his favor. The 1930s began in blood. The old Mafia world, rooted in Sicilian customs, ancient grudges and endless pride, was collapsing under its own weight. At the center of it all stood Lucky Luciano, watching the carnage unfold like a chess master moving his pieces across a board slick with blood. The Castellammarese War, as it came to be known, would be the crucible that forged his power and the event that destroyed the old order forever. For 2 years New York City's underworld burned. The war was fought between two titans, Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both were old-school Sicilians, products of another century, men who clung to ancient codes of loyalty and revenge. Masuria ruled through brutality and greed. Maranzano, more refined but equally ruthless, saw himself as a Roman emperor. He even referred to his soldiers as legionaries. Each wanted total control over the Mafia's operations in America, and neither would stop until the other was dead. Caught between them was Luciano. On paper he was Masuria's loyal lieutenant, one of his most trusted enforcers. But loyalty to the old ways had never been his guiding principle. Luciano was a pragmatist. He believed in survival, profit, and modernization. And as he watched hundreds of men die over pride and tradition, he realized the war was not about business, it was about ego. That made it a war worth ending. The Castellammarese War turned the city into a graveyard. Gunmen were gunned down in diners, shot in barber chairs, or found slumped behind steering wheels. Entire crews vanished overnight. Civilians learned to look away when they heard the echo of Tommy guns in the distance. The newspapers called it a gangland slaughter, but for Luciano it was a business failure. Every death, every feud was bad for profits. The more chaos there was, the less stability existed for rackets to thrive. Luciano began to plan, not for victory but for transformation. He knew that neither Masuria nor Maranzano could bring peace. They were relics of an old world trying to rule a new one. So he made a decision that would define his legacy. He would betray his boss to build a new kind of order. It was not a decision made lightly. In the Mafia, betrayal of one's capo was the gravest sin, punished by death. But Luciano saw it differently. To him it wasn't treason, it was evolution. If the Mafia was to survive in America, it needed to shed its old skin. The future would belong to those who could think like Americans, not Sicilians. In early 1931, Luciano arranged a secret meeting with Maranzano. The two men were enemies but they shared one goal, the elimination of Joe Masuria. Maranzano promised Luciano power and autonomy in exchange for his help. Luciano accepted, but with the quiet understanding that he was not aligning himself with a man, he was aligning himself with opportunity. On April 15, 1931, the trap was sprung. Luciano invited Masuria to lunch at a restaurant in Coney Island, a gesture of supposed peace after months of tension. They dined together, playing cards, sipping wine. At one point, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. When he returned, he didn't go back to the table. Moments later, 4 gunmen entered the restaurant: Albert Anastasia, Bugsy Siegel, Joe Adonis, and Vito Genovese. They opened fire. The legend says Masuria never even had time to stand up. When it was over, Luciano returned calmly, looked at the lifeless body of his former boss and walked out. The reign of Joe the Boss had ended. With Masuria dead, Maranzano declared himself Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. For a brief moment, it seemed peace had been restored. But Luciano saw through the illusion. Maranzano's rule was just another version of the same problem. One man at the top, everyone else beneath him. The war might have ended, but the system was still broken. Maranzano envisioned the Mafia as an empire patterned after ancient Rome. He reorganized the families into a hierarchy, naming himself the supreme leader. He handed out ranks, capos, soldiers, consiglieri, and demanded obedience. To some, it felt like progress. To Luciano, it was just another dictatorship. He smiled in public, nodded in meetings, and played the loyal subordinate. But in private, he was already planning his next move. Maranzano's arrogance was his undoing. He called Luciano too American, mocking his friendships with Jews and Irishmen. Worse, he began quietly plotting Luciano's assassination. Word of that plot reached Luciano before the first bullet could. This time, Luciano didn't wait to be betrayed. He struck first. On September 10, 1931, Maranzano summoned Luciano to his office in Manhattan's Helmsley building. But Luciano, sensing the trap, sent men in his place. Disguised as government agents, they entered Maranzano's office under the pretense of conducting a raid. When they reached his desk, they drew their guns. Maranzano's reign ended as swiftly as it began. With both Masuria and Maranzano gone, Luciano stood atop the ruins of the old Mafia world. He was just 34 years old. There was no boss of bosses now by design. Luciano abolished the title completely, declaring that no man should ever hold absolute power again. Instead, he created something revolutionary, a governing body made up of equals designed to prevent future wars. It would be called the Commission. The Castellamarese War was more than a blood feud, it was the turning point that transformed crime from tribal conflict into organized enterprise. Luciano understood that order could exist even in lawlessness, if the system was designed correctly. He had learned from watching men die for pride that fear and honor were unreliable currencies. Profit, however, was universal. By the time the smoke cleared, Luciano had done something no one thought possible. He had ended a war not through peace but through logic. He had united enemies, balanced power, and created a framework that would define organized crime for generations. The Mafia was no longer just an ethnic brotherhood, it was a corporate machine. From that moment forward, Lucky Luciano wasn't just another mobster. He was the architect of the modern underworld. The world he inherited was built on chaos and blood, but the world he created would be built on calculation and control. And though history would remember the Castellamarese War for its brutality, Luciano would remember it as his rebirth, the day he traded loyalty for legacy, and became the king of a new kind of order. When the smoke of the Castellamarese War finally cleared, New York's underworld stood at a crossroads. Hundreds of men were dead, and the old Sicilian hierarchy lay in ruins. The city was quieter now, but only for a moment. The world of organized crime had been cracked open, waiting for someone to reshape it. That someone was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. In the wake of the war, Luciano made a decision that would forever alter the structure of the American Mafia. He abolished the title Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. No more tyrants, no more civil wars fought over crowns. Instead, he proposed something entirely new, something the Mafia had never seen before: the Commission. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of a single autocrat, Luciano envisioned a boardroom of equals, leaders from each of the major families who would meet, discuss, vote, and make decisions collectively. It was corporate governance for criminals. The Commission would arbitrate disputes, control territories, and ensure that money flowed without interruption. Violence, once the Mafia's language, would now be its last resort. To understand how radical this was, you have to imagine what came before: endless cycles of vengeance, grudges stretching back to Sicily, and bosses who killed simply to assert dominance. Luciano broke with centuries of tradition in a single stroke. He wasn't just trying to avoid war, he was creating a system to make sure it could never happen again. In 1931, the first meeting of the Commission took place in New York. Luciano presided, calm and confident. Around the table sat the new generation of American crime lords, men like Joe Bonanno, Tommy Gagliano, Vincent Mangano, and Joe Prophesy. Each represented one of the 5 families that would dominate New York for decades to come. Beyond the city, Luciano extended invitations to powerful bosses in Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Buffalo. The Commission wasn't just a New York innovation, it was a national one. Luciano's vision was clear: crime should run like business. He divided territories, standardized rules, and even introduced an early form of profit sharing. If a conflict arose, the Commission would mediate. If someone broke the peace, they would face collective retribution. No single family could unilaterally start a war again. For the first time in the history of the Mafia, there was something resembling order. In a smoky conference room, amid the clinking of glasses and the rustle of expensive suits, the men agreed: the future of organized crime would be built not on bloodlines but on efficiency. The Commission became the backbone of a new criminal world, one where the Mafia's violence was hidden behind respectability, its chaos masked by structure. But the Commission wasn't just about management, it was about psychology. Luciano understood human nature better than anyone. He knew that if you gave powerful men a voice, they would fight less to be heard. By creating the illusion of equality, he kept control. Every boss believed he had a say, but everyone knew Luciano was the quiet force behind every major decision. He had traded overt dominance for subtle authority, and that made him even more dangerous. The system worked brilliantly. Disputes that once ended in bloodshed were now settled through negotiation. The Mafia's reach expanded beyond New York, spreading into Chicago, New Orleans, and Los Angeles. Luciano's commission even began coordinating with non-Italian groups, Jewish syndicates led by Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Irish racketeers, and corrupt unions. Together, they formed a network that blurred the line between the criminal underworld and legitimate business. To the public, Luciano's empire was invisible. To those inside it, it was perfection. Every racket, from bootlegging and gambling to construction and labor unions, was taxed, organized, and regulated. Nothing moved without approval. A percentage of every profit went up the chain, distributed according to the commission's decisions. It was taxation without government, a parallel economy that rivaled the official one in size and sophistication. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. Luciano's influence extended into politics, law enforcement, and even the courts. Judges were bribed, police captains bought, and politicians funded through back channels. The Mafia, once a collection of street gangs, had become a shadow institution. It operated silently, efficiently, invisibly. Luciano's genius was not that he ended crime, it was that he organized it. He made corruption predictable. Instead of chaos, he offered stability. Instead of blood feuds, he offered profit. The very thing that made him a criminal also made him a visionary. Yet, as orderly as it seemed, the Commission's creation was also an act of control disguised as democracy. Luciano knew that absolute power, openly wielded, invited rebellion. But hidden power, dispersed just enough to appear shared, could last forever. The bosses believed they were partners, but in reality, they were shareholders in Luciano's design. He had turned crime into a corporation and himself into its CEO. The results were undeniable. Violence dropped, profits soared, and law enforcement struggled to keep up. The Mafia's new structure was impenetrable. No single arrest could topple the system. No single assassination could change its course. The Commission had made organized crime sustainable, immortal, even. But every system, no matter how perfect, carries the seed of its own downfall. Luciano's new order depended on balance, secrecy, and loyalty. It depended on men being rational, on greed being contained. And in the world Luciano ruled, those were fragile things. Still, in those first years, it seemed as though he had achieved the impossible. For the first time in the history of American organized crime, there was peace. The wars had ended, and in their place stood a machine that printed money and commanded respect. Luciano had taken the Mafia out of the back alleys and into boardrooms. He had transformed it from an immigrant's survival mechanism into a national institution. In photographs from that era, Luciano stands in tailored suits, cigarette between his fingers, eyes calm but watchful. He looks less like a gangster than a statesman. And in a way he was just one whose kingdom existed beneath the law's surface. He had no illusions of morality. He knew exactly what he was. But he also knew that history would remember him not merely as a criminal, but as the man who gave the underworld a constitution. And for a time that constitution worked flawlessly. The Commission stood as a monument to Luciano's brilliance, a democracy built on fear, loyalty, and profit. A world where chaos was outlawed and order reigned supreme. The king of the underworld had done what no one else could. He made crime make sense. The 1930s were Luciano's golden years, a time when his empire stretched from the docks of New York to the casinos of Havana, from the speakeasies of Chicago to the backrooms of Hollywood. He was no longer just a gangster. He was the silent architect of an invisible empire, the one man everyone owed and no one could defy. But even in his world of alliances and profits, trust was a fragile currency. The Mafia was built on loyalty, and destroyed by ambition. Luciano's power depended on balance, a careful harmony among dangerous men, each with their own appetite for control. Around him, the constellation of allies and enemies constantly shifted. Some would become his most trusted partners. Others would become his executioners. His inner circle was a reflection of his genius, and his curse. At the heart of it were three men who defined the new era of organized crime: Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello. They were not just associates, they were co-conspirators in building the future. Meyer Lansky was the brain, a quiet, calculating genius with a gift for numbers and diplomacy. While Luciano ruled the streets, Lansky ruled the books. Together, they forged a vision that merged Italian muscle with Jewish intellect, creating a criminal alliance unlike anything before. Lansky taught Luciano the language of finance, the art of laundering money through legitimate businesses, the discipline of staying invisible. Where other gangsters wanted fame, Lansky wanted sustainability. Bugsy Siegel, on the other hand, was the fire, reckless, charismatic, and dangerous. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and made people nervous without saying a word. Siegel was the prototype of the modern gangster, handsome, fast-talking, unpredictable. He and Luciano were opposites, yet inseparable. Siegel represented the violence Luciano needed to keep his empire in check, the sword to Lansky's brain. And then there was Frank Costello, the diplomat. While Luciano dealt with mob bosses, Costello dealt with senators, judges and police commissioners. He didn't carry a gun, he carried a glass of scotch and a Rolodex. Costello became the bridge between the underworld and the upper world, a man who could turn corruption into respectability. He was the smooth face of organized crime, the one who understood that power didn't just come from fear, it came from influence. Together they formed a syndicate that reached into every corner of American life. Gambling dens, horse tracks, liquor distribution, construction contracts, labor unions, every racket had a price tag, and that price ultimately led back to Luciano. He didn't need to be everywhere. His system was everywhere for him. But power attracts power, and the same alliances that made Luciano strong also made him vulnerable. Around him the landscape began to shift. Men like Joe Bonanno and Vito Genovese watched with envy. They respected Luciano, but they also feared him. And in the Mafia, fear is never permanent. Vito Genovese in particular, was a shadow lurking behind every move. He had been Luciano's lieutenant, a man of brutal efficiency and limitless ambition. Genovese shared Luciano's intelligence, but not his restraint. He believed Luciano had grown too comfortable, too willing to work with Jews and Irishmen, too willing to compromise with politicians. To Genovese, Luciano was forgetting what the Mafia was supposed to be. There were whispers that Luciano's Americanization was corrupting the old ways, that his modern vision was too dangerous. Some called him a visionary, others called him a traitor. But Luciano didn't care what they called him. As long as the money flowed and the streets stayed quiet, he believed he was untouchable. Then came the outsiders, the enemies who didn't play by his rules. Among them were Dutch Schultz, a volatile Jewish gangster from the Bronx, and Thomas Dewey, an ambitious prosecutor whose moral crusade would soon bring Luciano to his knees. Dutch Schultz was a problem Luciano couldn't ignore. Schultz was unpredictable, paranoid, and prone to violence. He wanted Dewey dead. He even petitioned the commission for permission to assassinate him. Luciano refused. Killing a prosecutor, he argued, would bring too much heat. But Schultz was not a man who listened to reason. When he started planning Dewey's murder anyway, Luciano made the hardest decision of his career. On October 23, 1935, Schultz was dining with his crew in a Newark restaurant when hitmen burst in. They gunned him down in a hail of bullets. The message was clear. No one, not even allies, could threaten the structure Luciano built. Order came before friendship. But killing Schultz didn't end the threat, it only delayed it. The murder made Dewey more determined. He launched an all-out war against organized crime, targeting the top rather than the street. For the first time, Luciano's empire faced a foe it couldn't bribe or intimidate. Meanwhile, within the Mafia, Genovese began to maneuver. He whispered in the dark, making alliances, sowing doubts. He told the old-school bosses that Luciano's commission was too soft, that the syndicate was losing its soul. And as Dewey's investigations drew closer, Genovese's ambitions grew. Luciano, for all his intelligence, could not control everything. He had created a system built on loyalty, but loyalty in the Mafia was conditional, a matter of convenience, not morality. As his empire expanded, so did the cracks beneath it. He was at the height of his power but also at the edge of his downfall. The alliances that had made him untouchable were now fragile threads stretched across ambition and betrayal. Every man around him, ally or enemy, wanted something. Some wanted money. Some wanted control. Some simply wanted him gone. And yet, in those years, Luciano remained calm, perhaps too calm. He attended lavish dinners, mingled with actors, politicians, and businessmen. The newspapers called him the Underworld's gentleman. But behind that charm was a man who knew that empires built on blood never stay clean for long. He once told Lansky over a quiet drink, "If I ever go down, it won't be because of the cops. It'll be because of one of our own." It was prophecy, and it was true. The web of alliances Luciano had spun so perfectly was beginning to unravel, one thread at a time. Because in the Mafia, every partnership carries a price. Every favor has an expiration date. And even kings in the underworld are always one betrayal away from falling. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire had reached its zenith, a silent kingdom ruled from the shadows. His network of rackets stretched across the country, his influence reached into City Hall, and his profits rivaled those of legitimate corporations. On the surface it was peace. The commission functioned like clockwork. Violence was down, money was up, and the Mafia had never been stronger or more organized. But beneath that polished order, a hidden war was brewing, one that would not be fought with guns in the streets, but with whispers, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of one man who refused to be intimidated, Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was the embodiment of the American ideal, young, ambitious, incorruptible. He was a prosecutor with a moral fire that burned against everything Luciano stood for. Where others saw the Mafia as untouchable, Dewey saw a challenge. He had made his name taking down bootleggers and corrupt politicians, and now he set his sights on the biggest target of all, the man who, though never caught with a weapon, controlled the nation's criminal economy. For years, Luciano had avoided direct prosecution. He kept his hands clean, his name distant from any paper trail or act of violence. His business was conducted through layers of intermediaries, men who were loyal, silent, and expendable. He had survived police raids, political scandals, and bloody wars between mob families. But Dewey represented something different, a new kind of threat. Dewey didn't chase gangsters with guns, he chased them with evidence. He built cases like machines, methodical, deliberate, relentless. And he wasn't looking for street thugs or petty bootleggers. He was going straight to the top. The weakness in Luciano's empire wasn't in his men or his money, it was in his vices. The one racket he could never fully control was prostitution. For years, the Mafia had profited from the sex trade, brothels, madams, and protection rackets. But it was chaotic, difficult to manage, and vulnerable to exposure. It was also the perfect pressure point for Dewey to attack. In 1936, Dewey launched a full-scale investigation into New York's prostitution network. His detectives raided dozens of brothels, arresting hundreds of women and low-level pimps. Most of them said nothing, they feared the mob more than prison. But then one woman broke the silence. Her name was Cora the Canary Greenbaum, and her testimony changed history. Under oath, she claimed that the entire prostitution network, the madams, the pimps, the payoffs, ultimately led back to one man, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. It was the first real crack in Luciano's armor. He denied everything, of course. He claimed he had retired from street business, that he was just a nightclub owner, a businessman. But Dewey's case was too strong. 4 months, his team built a web of witnesses, documents, and financial records linking Luciano's lieutenants to prostitution profits. Dewey didn't need to catch Luciano in the act, he just needed to prove that his orders kept the machine running. Behind closed doors, the Mafia world erupted in panic. Luciano's closest associates urged him to flee, to Cuba, to Mexico, anywhere beyond Dewey's reach. But Lucky refused. He believed he could outsmart the prosecutor just as he had outsmarted every rival before. He trusted his lawyers, his influence, his money. He believed that power could still protect him. But Dewey was methodical and he had the press on his side. Newspapers called it the war against the underworld. For the first time, the American public saw Luciano's name in headlines, not as a rumor but as a villain. The man who had prided himself on invisibility was suddenly everywhere. As Dewey's investigation deepened, Luciano's enemies saw opportunity. Vito Genovese, ever the vulture, began making quiet moves to fill the vacuum if Luciano fell. He assured everyone he was loyal, but he also began building relationships with Dewey's investigators, offering information through back channels. No one could ever prove it, but whispers of Genovese's betrayal spread fast, that he had subtly guided Dewey toward Luciano's weak spots. Luciano, meanwhile, fought back through influence. He tried to bribe officials, intimidate witnesses, and disrupt Dewey's case. But it was too late. Dewey had built an army of informants. The once untouchable underworld was now turning on itself. In February 1936, Dewey made his move. Luciano was arrested in Arkansas, where he had fled temporarily after being tipped off that an indictment was imminent. The news hit like a thunderclap across the country. The king of the underworld, the man who had ruled through invisibility, was finally in handcuffs. The trial that followed became a national spectacle. Dewey portrayed Luciano as the mastermind of vice, a man who had corrupted the moral fabric of the nation. Luciano's lawyers called the charges absurd, claiming he had no involvement with prostitution. But the witnesses kept coming, women who wept on the stand, describing brutal pimps and the men they claimed collected money for Lucky. For the first time, Luciano faced a force he couldn't silence. The courtroom was his battlefield now, not the alleys or backrooms where he had always controlled the rules. Dewey was winning not just with evidence but with narrative. He painted Luciano as a symbol of everything wrong with America's underworld, powerful, untouchable, and proud of it. Luciano sat calmly through the proceedings, impeccably dressed, smirking at the witnesses. But behind his cool demeanor, he could feel the tide turning. He had always believed that fear and respect could shield him, that power made him immune. But in that courtroom he realized that the true enemy of power is exposure. Once the public saw him as a criminal king, no amount of money or control could save him. Outside the courtroom, the Mafia world began to fracture. Without Luciano's steady hand, rival bosses grew anxious. The commission met in secret, unsure whether to defend him or cut ties. Vito Genovese, predictably, argued for distance. Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky tried to rally support, but the message was clear. In the world Luciano had built, no one was safe from the fall of its creator. As the trial neared its end, Dewey's evidence piled high: ledgers, testimony, surveillance. The jurors didn't just see a gangster, they saw an empire of exploitation. When the verdict finally came down, it was devastating. Guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison. The newspapers screamed it across the front page: "Lucky Luciano convicted, King of the Underworld falls." It was the beginning of the end. The man who had brought order to chaos was now confined behind bars. The commission that had once ruled the nation's underworld was suddenly leaderless, uncertain, and afraid. And though Luciano was gone, the hidden war he had fought, against law, betrayal, and fate, was far from over. Because in prison, Lucky Luciano would soon discover that true power doesn't always come from freedom. Sometimes, it comes from the ability to control a world you can no longer touch. The hidden war had reached its climax, and Luciano had lost. The verdict came down like a thunderclap: guilty on all counts. 30 to 50 years in state prison. For Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who had ruled New York's underworld like an emperor, it was a fall so spectacular that even his enemies couldn't help but marvel. The courtroom erupted in flashes of cameras as reporters fought for a glimpse of the man who, for years, had been a ghost in plain sight. Luciano remained composed. No tears. No outrage. Just the faintest smirk, as though the whole thing were a business inconvenience rather than the destruction of a dynasty. But behind that mask of calm was a storm. For the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano had lost control. As he was led away in handcuffs, the irony was impossible to ignore. The man who had built the most efficient criminal empire in America was being undone not by bullets or betrayal, but by bureaucracy. The law had succeeded where no assassin could. He was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a maximum security prison so remote it was called Little Siberia. The winters were brutal, the walls cold, and the isolation absolute. For most men it was the end of everything. But Luciano was not most men. Even behind bars he was still lucky. At first, prison life was a shock. Gone were the tailored suits, the cigars, the fine dinners. In their place were coarse uniforms, hard labor, and the monotony of a cell. But Luciano quickly adapted. He learned to navigate prison the same way he had navigated the streets, through respect, favors, and control. Within weeks he was running things from the inside. The guards liked him. He was polite, generous, never caused trouble. Fellow inmates respected him. He had a way of making even the smallest man feel important. Soon he had privileges others could only dream of: better food, access to visitors, quiet deals with wardens. Luciano turned his cell into an office. Outside those walls the world kept spinning and changing. The Mafia was evolving without him. Vito Genovese, sensing opportunity, positioned himself as the heir apparent. Frank Costello managed to hold the commission together, but the unity Luciano had built was fraying. The Mafia's peace was an illusion, held together by fear, nostalgia, and money. Luciano's arrest had done something deeper than just remove a leader. It had broken the spell. For years, his power had been absolute because it was unseen, untested. Now that he was gone, everyone began asking the same question: was Lucky ever really untouchable? Yet even from prison his influence lingered. Messages flowed in and out through visitors, lawyers, and coded letters. Luciano still gave advice, approved decisions, and settled disputes. He could no longer command with presence, but he could command with memory. His name alone was enough to keep men loyal, or afraid. Still the cracks widened. Genovese was restless. He wanted the throne, and he didn't want to wait for permission. He began undermining Costello, spreading rumors that Luciano's imprisonment meant divine judgment, that the old boss's American ways had cursed them. Genovese wanted to return the Mafia to its Sicilian roots: strict hierarchy, no outsiders, no democracy. The commission, without Luciano's charisma to mediate, became a table of silent suspicion. Every meeting ended with forced smiles and nervous glances. Each boss knew the peace wouldn't last forever. Meanwhile, outside the world of crime, America itself was changing. The Great Depression was ending, war was looming in Europe, and New York was transforming into a modern metropolis. The era of bootlegging and backroom deals was fading into history. Luciano's old world was slipping away. From his prison cell, Lucky watched the newspapers with quiet calculation. He read about politics, economics, and the war in Europe. He understood something the others didn't: power was shifting. Governments were becoming stronger, surveillance more advanced, and the Mafia's golden age of invisibility was dying. But he also saw opportunity. War, after all, created chaos, and chaos was the one thing he understood better than anyone. Then came the whispers, about German U-boats stalking the American coast, about Nazi spies operating in New York's harbors. When the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, the Navy faced a problem: sabotage on the docks, missing cargo, mysterious fires. They needed control of the waterfront, and there was only one man who had ever truly controlled it: Lucky Luciano. In a twist almost too strange for fiction, the U.S. government, the same system that had condemned him, turned to Luciano for help. Through intermediaries, naval intelligence reached out to Meyer Lansky, who was still loyal to his old friend. The message was simple: if Luciano could guarantee protection and order on the docks, the government would remember it. And just like that, the man branded America's most dangerous criminal became a silent partner in America's war effort. Through Lansky and Costello, Luciano reached his old contacts on the docks and in the unions. Orders were passed quietly, efficiently: anyone sabotaging you ships was to be dealt with permanently. Within weeks the fire stopped. The docks ran smoothly. The Mafia had done what the government could not. Luciano never left prison during this arrangement, but his legend grew. Soldiers whispered his name, reporters speculated about his involvement, and politicians quietly thanked him without ever saying so publicly. He had once again proven that power wasn't about freedom, it was about reach. Yet despite his cooperation, Luciano knew the tide had turned. He could help the government, but he could never be forgiven. The public saw him as the embodiment of evil, the face of organized vice. To many, his imprisonment was justice served. To him, it was proof that no empire, not even one built in the shadows, could escape the light forever. In the cold nights of Dannemora, Luciano would sit on his bunk and think about the irony of it all. He had once ruled New York, controlled men who killed with a glance, dictated the fate of cities. Now his power was reduced to whispers on paper, filtered through guards and visitors. He still believed he would one day walk free. He told himself that every king suffers exile before his return. But deep down he knew the truth. He had built an empire so powerful that it could function without him. The machine no longer needed its maker. That was the cruelest twist of all. His rise had been about control. His fall was about acceptance, the realization that power, once released, develops a life of its own. The Mafia was no longer Lucky Luciano's creation, it was his legacy. And legacies cannot be imprisoned. Still he waited, quietly, patiently, calculating as always. Because even behind bars, Lucky Luciano wasn't finished. He was planning something no one saw coming. A return that would rewrite his story, blur the line between redemption and manipulation, and prove that even from a cage the king of the underworld could still move the world's pieces. The trial of Lucky Luciano wasn't just a courtroom battle, it was a public spectacle, the ultimate showdown between order and chaos, law and the underworld. For years, Luciano had existed like a ghost, whispered about, feared, admired, but never seen in chains. Now he was front and center, under the blinding lights of the press, sitting in the defendant's chair with the same calm confidence that had once ruled New York streets. District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey made sure this trial would send a message. His strategy was simple but devastating: show the jury not just evidence, but a story, one where Luciano wasn't just a man, but a symbol of America's moral decay. Dewey stood in front of 12 jurors and declared that this case was about the destruction of organized vice, the cancer that eats away at society. The evidence was damning. Over 60 witnesses, most of them prostitutes, madams, and pimps, took the stand to describe how the network worked, how payments were collected for Lucky, how his lieutenants made weekly visits to collect envelopes, how fear of retaliation kept everyone silent for years. Many witnesses spoke behind screens or under police protection. Others broke down mid-testimony, their voices trembling as they recounted beatings and threats. Luciano's defense team fought back aggressively. His attorney, Moses Polikoff, argued that there wasn't a single piece of direct evidence tying Luciano to prostitution. He mocked Dewey's witnesses, calling them disgruntled women desperate to save themselves. Luciano himself remained stoic, hands folded, face unreadable, as if the trial were nothing more than another business meeting. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Some came to jeer, others to stare at the man whose name had haunted headlines for years. Women swooned at his movie star looks, men whispered about his ruthlessness. Inside, the press turned every moment into drama. Headlines screamed, "Vice King faces doom," and "Luciano's empire exposed." It wasn't just a trial, it was a morality play for the Depression-era public, hungry for justice against a world that seemed rigged by corruption. But behind the spectacle, there were layers of irony. Many of the politicians and police officers praising Dewey had themselves taken money from Luciano's organization. The same system that now condemned him had quietly thrived under his influence. Yet once he became too visible, too powerful, that same system turned on him to cleanse its conscience. In the end, Dewey didn't need a smoking gun. He needed only to convince the jury that a man like Luciano could not exist without guilt. And on June 6, 1936, he succeeded. After less than a day of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. When the judge announced the sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison, a hush fell over the courtroom. Then came the flashbulbs. Reporters rushed forward, shouting questions. Luciano stood, adjusted his tie, and smiled faintly. "Tell Dewey he's a good man," he said, his voice calm. It was a line meant to project control, but everyone in the room knew it was the sound of a man masking the realization that the empire he had built was collapsing. That moment marked the true end of the golden age of organized crime's invisibility. The law had drawn blood. The myth of untouchability was shattered. For Thomas Dewey, the trial was a political triumph. It would launch his career and make him a national figure. For Luciano, it was the start of a long exile in iron and concrete. Yet even as he was led away in shackles, there was something defiant in his eyes, as if he was already calculating his next move, already rewriting the story in his mind. Because for Lucky Luciano, every loss was just another opening, another chance to turn defeat into power. Prison should have been the end of Lucky Luciano. 30 to 50 years, that was a lifetime. Sing Sing and Dannemora weren't places a man went to and came back from with his power intact. They were meant to erase legends, to grind kings into dust. But Luciano wasn't like other men. He didn't just survive prison. He found a way to rule from behind bars. When he arrived at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, known as Little Siberia for its freezing isolation, he was no longer the dapper don of Manhattan nightclubs. His tailored suits were replaced by prison grays, his polished shoes by state-issued boots. But even in chains, Luciano carried himself like a man still in charge. Guards noticed it immediately: the calm, the posture, the quiet confidence that told everyone he hadn't surrendered anything except his freedom of movement. The other inmates called him the man, and soon even the guards followed suit. Within weeks, Luciano's cell became an unofficial headquarters. Cigarettes, food, favors, everything flowed through him. The same logic that once ran New York's underworld now ran the prison yard. He knew how to create order in chaos, and for men trapped behind bars, order was power. But Luciano's mind never stopped working. He wasn't content with being a prison boss, he wanted to keep the syndicate alive. He began sending coded messages through visitors, lawyers, and even corrupt guards. Frank Costello, still free and politically connected, became his main contact on the outside. Together they maintained the flow of money and influence. Luciano's lieutenants kept paying their dues, operations kept running, and the Mafia commission continued to meet, always leaving an empty chair for him, a silent symbol that their true leader was still present. This invisible control made Luciano almost mythical. Law enforcement couldn't understand how a man behind bars could still pull strings across the country. But to those in the underworld it made perfect sense. Luciano had never been about physical presence. He was about structure, a system of loyalty that ran deeper than bars or borders. And then came World War II, an unexpected twist that would bring Luciano's influence into play on a national stage once more. By 1942 the U.S. was at war with the Axis powers, and the American coastline was a growing concern. German U-boats had begun attacking ships near New York Harbor, and the government feared enemy infiltration through the docks. The Navy needed help, and someone whispered a name: Lucky Luciano. At first it sounded absurd. Why would the U.S. military cooperate with a convicted mob boss? But desperate times required desperate measures. The Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence secretly approached Luciano's lawyers with an offer. In exchange for his assistance securing the docks and gathering intelligence in Sicily, they would consider reducing his sentence. Luciano didn't hesitate. He saw opportunity where others saw punishment. Through his network of dockworkers, longshoremen, and gang contacts, he ensured that no further sabotage occurred on the New York waterfront. And when Allied forces invaded Sicily in 1943, Luciano's old connections there, men who still remembered his influence, helped smooth the occupation. Mafia informants provided safe passage, intelligence, and local cooperation. It was one of history's strangest alliances. The U.S. government and the American Mafia, united against the Nazis. The press never learned the full story, but the whispers spread. Inside Dannemora, guards treated Luciano differently now, not as a criminal, but as a man who had somehow made himself indispensable to the country that had condemned him. When the war ended, the government quietly fulfilled its promise. In 1946, Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who had once vowed to destroy him, commuted Luciano's sentence. The irony was staggering. The prosecutor who had built his career on bringing down the Mafia was now the man signing the paper that set its architect free. But freedom came with a price. Luciano wasn't truly free. As part of the deal, he was deported to Italy, never again allowed to return to the United States. He walked out of prison not as a returning king, but as an exile, a man stripped of his homeland, his empire, and the illusion of control he had built his life upon. Yet even as he prepared to leave, Luciano couldn't help but smile. He had outlasted his enemies, manipulated the system, and turned his imprisonment into another chapter of power. What other gangster could say they helped win a world war from a prison cell? In the end, Luciano's time behind bars revealed something fundamental about who he was. He wasn't just a criminal or a boss, he was a strategist of human behavior, a man who understood that real power doesn't live in freedom, it lives in influence. Even surrounded by walls and guards, he remained untouchable, not because of his wealth or violence, but because he had mastered the one currency that never runs out, loyalty. From his cell, he had rewritten the rules once again, proving that the Mafia's greatest weapon wasn't the gun or the knife. It was the mind of Lucky Luciano. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship in 1946 onto the docks of Naples, the warm Mediterranean air felt both familiar and foreign. He was free but not home. America, the land where he had built an empire, redefined organized crime, and etched his name into history, was gone to him forever. What awaited him in Italy was not triumph, but exile. He was 49 years old, wealthy beyond imagination, and yet adrift, a king without a kingdom. At first, Naples greeted him like a celebrity. Reporters flocked to catch a glimpse of the infamous American gangster. The Italian underworld, too, saw him as a legend, a living myth from across the Atlantic. Luciano rented a luxurious villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, surrounded by a handful of loyal associates. He lived comfortably, but there was an emptiness to his existence. The man who once commanded meetings that shaped the criminal world now spent his days pacing marble floors, staring out at the sea, replaying his glory days like a film reel that refused to end. But Luciano was not made for quiet. He soon began rebuilding, not the same empire but a shadow version of it. He met with Sicilian and Neapolitan figures, men who controlled the black markets that had thrived in the chaos after the war. Food, medicine, cigarettes, everything had value in post-war Italy, and Luciano knew value better than anyone. Within a few years, whispers spread. Lucky Luciano was back in business. His influence soon extended beyond Italy. Through old contacts and new intermediaries, he helped reconnect American syndicates with European suppliers. Some historians believe he played a key role in establishing the heroin trade routes that linked Marseille, Sicily, and New York, what would later be known as the French Connection. Whether by direct command or subtle suggestion, Luciano's fingerprints seemed to appear on the next evolution of global organized crime. But not everyone welcomed his return to power. Italian and American authorities watched him closely, tracking his every move. He was arrested several times in Italy on suspicion of drug trafficking, though never convicted. Each time he denied involvement, claiming he was retired, that he just wanted peace. "I'm just an old man trying to live," he told reporters. But no one believed him. And in truth, peace eluded him. Luciano's power had always come from movement, from being everywhere and nowhere, pulling strings across continents. In Italy, he was confined by surveillance, shadowed by police, surrounded by ghosts. The commission no longer called him for guidance. Frank Costello was aging. Lansky had gone quiet. Bugsy Siegel was dead, shot through the window of his Beverly Hills mansion in 1947. Each death, each silence, reminded Luciano that the world he built was slowly fading. By the 1950s, a new generation of mobsters had taken over. They were more ruthless, less romantic, men who saw Luciano as ancient history. Yet, in the twilight of his life, he found something resembling clarity. He began reflecting on what he had done and what it had cost. In rare interviews, his tone shifted from defiant to philosophical. "I gave the people what they wanted," he once said. "Gambling, girls, liquor. I didn't make the laws. I just supplied the demand." It was part justification, part confession. The self-awareness of a man who knew he had built his power on both genius and sin. Despite the surveillance, Luciano never truly stopped working. In the early 1960s he began cooperating with producers on a film about his life, perhaps his final attempt to control his own narrative. He met regularly with Martin Gosch, a screenwriter, to tell his version of events. He wanted the world to remember him not as a criminal, but as an organizer, a man who brought structure to chaos. "Without me," he told Gosch, "there'd still be gang wars on every street corner." But fate had its own ending planned. On January 26, 1962, Luciano arrived at Naples airport to meet a film producer who promised to bring his story to the screen. As he greeted the man, witnesses saw Luciano clutch his chest and collapse on the tarmac. He died instantly of a heart attack. His last act, ironically, an attempt to turn his own life into legend. When the news reached America, old gangsters raised their glasses in quiet respect. Even his enemies acknowledged what he had achieved. In his death, as in life, Lucky Luciano remained a paradox. The criminal who brought order, the exile who shaped empires, the man who could never truly escape the world he had created. They buried him in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, not far from the streets where his journey began. Though deported in life, in death he returned home. The man who had once ruled the underworld of America now rested in its soil, his story complete. A tale of brilliance, ambition, and the heavy price of power. Lucky Luciano's death did not end his story, it transformed it into legend. In the years following his passing, his name became more than that of a gangster. It became shorthand for the birth of modern organized crime. The myth of Luciano grew larger than the man himself, a paradox of respect and fear, brilliance and brutality, discipline and betrayal. To understand his legacy is to understand how one man reshaped the DNA of the American underworld, and how his influence still echoes in every corner of global crime. Before Luciano, the Mafia in America was a battlefield of tribes, an anarchic struggle of ego and blood. After him, it became a system, a corporation of crime with a boardroom structure and defined rules. He turned chaos into organization and in doing so, made the Mafia far more dangerous. The five families, the commission, the structure that balanced power and prevented endless gang wars, all of it was his design. To the underworld, he was the architect who gave them stability. To the law, he was the man who had taught criminals how to evolve faster than justice could catch them. But his legacy was not just organizational, it was psychological. Luciano understood people. He understood that power was not about violence but perception. He once said, "You don't need to use force if people believe you can." That philosophy became the foundation of Mafia leadership. Intimidation through reputation, control through loyalty, and influence through charm, these became the tools of the modern Don. Men like Carlo Gambino and even John Gotti would later mirror aspects of Luciano's method. Elegance on the outside, ruthlessness underneath. He also blurred the line between criminality and legitimacy. Under Luciano's model, mob money flowed into unions, real estate, casinos, and even politics. He turned bribery into a business expense and influence into an industry. In many ways he predicted the future, where crime would wear a suit, sit in an office, and operate under the illusion of respectability. The white-collar criminal ethos that dominated the mid-20th century, businessmen laundering money behind corporate fronts, had its roots in Luciano's pragmatic genius. Yet for all his innovation, Luciano's legacy was also deeply ironic. The system he built to prevent chaos eventually ensured his own irrelevance. After his exile, the commission continued without him. The next generation of bosses, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joseph Bonanno, all fought for the throne he had created. The wars he had worked to prevent flared up again, proving that order in the underworld was only ever temporary. His dream of unity, like his empire, was built on fragile loyalties and endless ambition. Still, even in his absence, his influence lingered like a ghost. When the Mafia expanded into Las Vegas in the 1950s, they were using Luciano's blueprint, combining vice, business, and spectacle. When the U.S. government investigated organized crime in the 1960s during the Kefauver hearings, every major figure they questioned traced their lineage back to Luciano's reforms. He had made the Mafia not just a criminal network, but a cultural institution, woven into the fabric of American life, politics, and mythology. Pop culture turned him into something more than human, a figure of fascination, the original modern gangster. Films, books, and documentaries painted him as both villain and visionary. To some, he was the devil who civilized crime. To others, a tragic hero undone by his own creation. Directors from Coppola to Scorsese would draw on his archetype, the charming Don torn between loyalty and survival, ambition and morality. Even decades after his death, every cinematic mob boss, from Michael Corleone to Tony Soprano, carried a trace of Lucky Luciano's shadow. But beyond the legend lies a quieter truth. Luciano's story is not just about crime, it's about the human hunger for control. He came from nothing, a poor Sicilian immigrant in a city that chewed up outsiders. He rose not through brute force but through intelligence and adaptation. In a world that gave him no legitimate path to power, he created his own. That's why his story endures, not just as history but as psychology. And yet, that same hunger for control became his downfall. For all his brilliance, he could never escape the machine he built. Every friend he made was also a potential betrayer. Every success carried the seed of ruin. In the end, the system he created, efficient, ruthless, hierarchical, consumed everyone, even him. Today, when historians and criminologists study organized crime, they still trace its roots to Luciano's reforms. His fingerprints are on the modern drug cartels, on the syndicates of Eastern Europe, on the transnational networks that run like shadow governments. In an unintended way, Luciano's legacy transcended the Mafia. It became a blueprint for power itself. And yet, for all his influence, the image that remains most haunting is not of Luciano the Don, but of Luciano the man, sitting alone in his Neapolitan villa, staring out at the sea, haunted by memories of what he built and lost. The king of the underworld, surrounded by silence. Because in the end, Lucky Luciano's legacy is a paradox. He brought order to chaos, but also proved that in the underworld, order is just another form of illusion. The story of Lucky Luciano ends not in a gunfight or a betrayal, but in silence. An irony that befits the man who once defined the sound of power. His empire was built in whispers, his rules carried in murmurs across backrooms, his name spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. And yet, as the years passed and his legend blurred into myth, Luciano became something more than the sum of his crimes. He became a symbol of ambition, intelligence, and the eternal tension between order and chaos. To understand why his story still matters, we must return to the beginning, a boy stepping off a ship from Sicily into the chaos of New York's Lower East Side. He arrived with nothing, no family wealth, no protection, no privilege, only hunger. Hunger for respect, for control, for survival. America in the early 1900s offered two roads to power, the legal one which was slow, uncertain, and barred to immigrants like him, or the illegal one which was dangerous but immediate. Luciano chose the latter, not because he wanted to destroy the system but because he wanted a seat at its table. In many ways, his life is the story of America itself, ambition without restraint, opportunity without morality. The same forces that built Wall Street and Hollywood also built men like Lucky Luciano. He saw the American dream for what it really was, a game of strategy where those who understood the rules could manipulate them. And in that sense, Luciano wasn't just a criminal. He was a mirror reflecting the era's contradictions. As the decades passed, his name became shorthand for transformation, the man who turned the violent chaos of the Mafia into an organized empire. He was, in his own words, a businessman who sold what people wanted. He brought logic to vice, management to murder, and diplomacy to domination. To the underworld he was a genius, to the law a menace, to historians a paradox. But behind every power there is a cost, and for Luciano the cost was peace. He lived his entire life on guard, surrounded by luxury but haunted by paranoia. Every friend could be a traitor, every ally a threat. The commission he built to keep peace became a stage for betrayal. The alliances he forged out of trust became cracks in his empire. For all his brilliance, Luciano never escaped the truth that no system built on fear can last forever. When he was deported to Italy, he carried no crown, no throne, no army, only memories of what he had built. Yet even in exile he remained an invisible force. The Mafia in America still used his name as a symbol of legitimacy. The old-timers called him the chairman, a title that implied permanence. But power, as Luciano had learned, is never permanent. In the end he became what all legends become, a myth shaped by the people who tell his story. To some, he was a hero of the immigrant struggle, a man who carved out respect in a world that denied it. To others, he was the embodiment of corruption, the man who industrialized vice, who turned crime into capitalism. Both versions are true because both existed within him. Lucky Luciano was neither good nor evil, he was simply human, driven by a need that transcends morality, the need to matter. If you look closely, his legacy still lives in the world we inhabit today. Every corporate boardroom that treats ethics as expendable, every politician who trades influence for loyalty, every institution that hides corruption behind structure, all echo the same logic Luciano once used to organize the streets. His genius was not that he invented organized crime, but that he recognized the structure of power as universal. In his world, whether you wore a silk suit or a police badge, everyone was part of the same game, some just had better cards. There's a certain poetry in how Luciano's story ends. A man who fought his entire life for control dying suddenly, alone, without warning. One moment he was shaking hands with a producer, discussing how to tell his story. The next he was gone, felled by his own heart. No gunfire, no betrayal, just the silence of inevitability. Perhaps it was fitting. A man who had always lived between myth and reality deserved an ending that blurred the two. When his body was brought back to New York, thousands came to pay their respects. Old gangsters, politicians, businessmen, men who would never admit how much they owed to him. Some came out of loyalty, others out of fear, others simply to see if the legend was truly dead. They buried him in Queens, in the same city that had once rejected and crowned him. On his tombstone, the name Charles Lucky Luciano stands simple and cold. No titles, no symbols, just a reminder that in death, even kings of the underworld are equal to everyone else. Yet, his ghost lingers in culture, in history, in psychology. Writers still dissect his choices. Filmmakers still borrow his silhouette. He remains the archetype of the modern Don, disciplined, strategic, charismatic, yet doomed by his own creation. Every story of power's rise and fall carries a fragment of his truth, that to control others, one must first sacrifice a piece of oneself. If Luciano's life offers a lesson, it is not about crime but about control. Power without balance consumes. Loyalty without trust collapses. Order built on fear eventually breeds rebellion. Luciano mastered the game, but he never mastered the cost of winning. His brilliance gave structure to chaos, but also ensured that he could never truly live outside it. In the final reckoning, Lucky Luciano's story is not just the chronicle of a gangster, it's a meditation on the nature of power itself. He showed that power, at its core, is an illusion, a fragile agreement between those who rule and those who obey. Break that agreement, and even the most formidable empire turns to dust. And yet, as we look back on the man and his myth, there's a strange admiration that remains. For all his crimes he had vision. For all his ruthlessness he had intelligence. He was both the best and worst of what ambition can create. The immigrant boy who became the architect of the American underworld still stands as one of history's most haunting contradictions. Proof that greatness and destruction often share the same face. His name endures not because of what he took but because of what he built. A legacy that outlived him, spread across continents and shaped generations. The king of the underworld may be gone, but his design, his blueprint for power, continues to whisper through time. Lucky Luciano's reign was born of chaos, defined by order, and ended in quiet exile. But perhaps that's the truest ending for a man like him. A man who ruled the shadows so completely that, in the end, he became one himself.